Fantasy, you're in the 06010. Focus. Fantasy Focus.
Hello and welcome into Fantasy Focus Football alongside Field Yates. My name is Daniel Dopp. Today's show is presented by Boost Mobile. There's no Mike Clay here today.
Hey, not only is today's show presented by Boost Mobile, today's show is presented by It's About Damn Time!
That's right, baby!
We finally got Mike off the show on a Thursday. What a glorious moment this is.
It's going to be so freeing and refreshing to feel like we can actually have a conversation. Exactly.
Actually, great. I'm literally kicking my feet up right now. This is awesome.
This might be the first two-person show we've done in this new studio. It's a little bit emptier than usual because of that, obviously. Mike out on a boondoggle, which he said yesterday, in case you listened to yesterday's show. If not, go ahead and go back. Listen to the Week 11 rankings show in case you have any questions there. But Mike out celebrating year one of ESPN Bet. So congratulations both to Mike and ESPN
Big
Bet.
shout out to everybody over at ESPN Bet.
Absolutely.
A lot of the people that have previously worked on ESPN Fantasy are now working over on ESPN Bet. So a ton of people that we love and respect and have really enjoyed seeing the first year of ESPN Bet and the growth, and I have a lot of confidence the growth is only going to continue into year two and beyond. And always, as you know, on Thursdays we are delivering a little ESPN Bet parlay, which
That's right.
we may have one for later
Have
on
one a little later on in the show
today.
Yeah, absolutely. Field and I are going to dive into basically a Week 11 preview, part one, a little bit more old school like we had been, because it's just you and I. We're going to open up the conversation a little bit more, go more game by game from that perspective.
Yeah, it seemed like a logical way to approach it today.
Yes, it
Mike gone as well tomorrow, so it'll be you, me, and Stefania doing the second half of our Week 11 preview.
I feel bad. Stefania's going to have to carry the load in that show without.
What else is
Mike
new?
play there. I mean, this is just how the way the show works.
Yep.
All right, well, let's dive in. We got a little bit of news that we're going to talk about off the top before we dive into some of these game previews, and we should start with the big one, Field Yates, the potential resurrection of a fantasy quarterback that we all once knew and loved as the starter of the Indianapolis Colts. It is Anthony Richardson, who will be taking over as the starter here in Week 11. Joe Flacco back to the bench. Anthony Richardson coming in as the starter. Just before we even talk fantasy, Field, just initial thoughts from you on this move by the Indianapolis Colts.
The Colts are like when my wife tries to decide where we're going for dinner. Right? It's like, hey, we're going to get Italian tonight. And then it's like, all right, we're getting ready. I booked the reservation online. It's like, you know what? I'm actually thinking maybe that Mediterranean joint instead.
You know what?
I just booked the reservation. No, it's fine. We'll stick with the Italian. But I really want Mediterranean, right? Like, they got to make up they got to make up. I'm going to take my feet down here. I'm just too relaxed.
Too much. It's too much.
They need to make up their mind. I understood why they made the decision to move off of Anthony Richardson and go to Joe Flacco. And they're still not that far out in the division because the Texans have kind of hit the fritz a little bit of late. They're still only 2 games back, are the Colts, of the Houston Texans. So not a totally insurmountable lead with 7 more games to go for each of those 2 teams. But obviously they have very little margin for error.
When you say they need to make up their mind, you don't feel like this was in the plans. It's just going to be a short-term sit, give you a couple weeks to have a breather, watch Joe Flacco, and then inevitably we're going to get back there. That wasn't what it felt like this was.
Yeah, I mean, the Colts said at the time that Joe Flacco is going to they at least intimated he's our guy for the rest of the season. They have now subsequently intimated that Anthony Richardson is going to be the guy for the rest of the season. There's no rule. It's not like if you say that, you have to stick with the guy for the rest of the year. So my general sense is that Anthony Richardson now has at least 2 more weeks as the starting quarterback. They go into a bye next week, so I think that Anthony Richardson will be the Colts starter in weeks 11 and 13 at minimum.
Okay.
Because even if he plays poorly this upcoming Sunday against the Jets, you can't just switch right back to Joe Flacco again. You're probably in that circumstance 4-7. The Cowboys are probably going to lose to the Texans on Monday Night Football. They're probably 7-4. You'd be 3 games back, and you might just say, let's take a big step back and worry about the development of our 22-year-old rookie second-year quarterback and make sure that we got to figure out whether we have something or nothing with this player, kind of like where Carolina might find themselves right now with Bryce Young.
Yep.
I don't even know how to feel about this truthfully. Like I don't actually know what emotion I was supposed to express yesterday because, at this point, like the Anthony Richardson call is off the mark. He'd have to be a top 5 quarterback the rest of the way to it feel even like slightly justified. I don't think that's in the cards for Anthony Richardson. What I am hoping for, Daniel, And we'll talk about the fantasy impact for the wide receivers because did you add Anthony Richardson on any rosters yesterday?
I did not add him because in the majority of the leagues that I'm in, people still had him at the end of benches.
Gotcha.
Still.
I didn't add him. I resisted temptation to do so. I feel like I've come this far emotionally. Might as well prevent myself from doing further damage.
Yeah. Don't reopen the
So
wound.
again, we'll talk about the wide receivers in just a minute. But I want the second half of this season, or the last 45% of this season, to show that the Colts have a plan and a vision for Anthony Richardson. And what I mean by that is I really would like to see them utilize him more as a runner. I think that he is such a unique athlete. And I think that quarterbacks who can run become more comfortable as passers when they're allowed to also dip their toes into their rushing upside, right? Yep. It's fitting a square peg into a round hole when you, or trying to at least, when you don't allow mobile quarterbacks to be anything other than pocket passers. I also would like to see Anthony Richardson show some progress himself. Better decision-making.
Yeah.
I would say better accuracy. That rushing upside I don't think that's a choice by him. I think it comes very naturally. I'd like to see more of that as well. So specific to Anthony Richardson, yes, there's a teeny tiny glimmer of hope for me. There always will be that hey, maybe he just immediately balls out this week, and from weeks 13 through 17, the final 5 weeks of the fantasy football season for a lot of leagues, Anthony Richardson just crushes it beyond this week.
This week, taking on the New York Jets field. Do you know where you have him ranked?
Yeah, I think I have him as quarterback 21.
21, okay. I got him at quarterback 16.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's, for me, the only ways that you're even considering starting him is if you're in a deep league or a potential super flex league. And there are a handful of guys that I would be comfortable just given the skill set starting him ahead of. But it's not like he is a high-end QB2 just coming in right off the bench. There's still plenty of question marks that even if you are starting him, you can't feel super great about it until we see it again, like we saw in week 1.
Yeah. I mean, that feels like forever ago, but man, it was a glorious moment when it took place. Also, this is what a testament this is to what the perception of the Jets defense is right now. Can you imagine last year with how well that Jets defense was playing if some team said, you know what, we're going to make the quarterback switch to the younger, raw guy against the Jets? This year, you kind of understand it, right? They can be excellent, can the Jets defense. They can also be non-factors, like they were this past weekend against Arizona when Kyler Murray had, 2 incompletions and, 3 or 4 touchdowns? It is a bad time right now for this New York Jets defense. So, again, I'm going to, hesitate going any further on the Anthony Richardson other than, just maintaining that slight bit of hope. Let's talk about the wide receivers, though. And really, this is crushing is too strong of a characterization, but it's a blow to the value of Josh Downs. There were some moments with Richardson. He did have a game, 4 catches, 109 yards, and a touchdown with Anthony Richardson. A lot of that yardage came on a very, very, very long touchdown, which was mostly run after catch. But it's a hit. It's a hit for him. It's a hit for Michael Pittman Jr., who did practice in full yesterday.
Love to see that.
So I knocked those 2 guys all the way down to wide receiver 28 for Josh Downs and wide receiver 47 for Michael Pittman Jr., who in 4 games with Anthony Richardson, 9.3 was the most fantasy points that he had in any of those games.
Wide receiver 28. This comes on the heels of yesterday's show where we talked about Josh Downs being wide receiver 18 or 19 in the majority of our rankings. Mike moved the projection down a full 2 fantasy points with this switch from Joe Flacco to be able to get to
Anthony Richardson. I don't know. Do you feel any more confident in them?
No.
I think the only way that you can would be, and I don't know, are you buying this or not?
So
you buy this. Would you buy that? I don't know about rock bottom, but there was a low point hit for Anthony Richardson.
Yes.
If I'm Richardson, my mindset is I have nothing to lose anymore.
Yeah.
I've already been sent to the bench.
Yep.
And what happens if I play poorly again? I go back to the bench? That's happened. Do you think mentally and emotionally, he's going to go in there I'm going to go out there and just play the freest football of my life and crush it? Or do you think that's still a long shot?
That's a great question. There is so much depth to that field when you're talking about a kid in his early 20s that maybe got benched for the first time ever in his legitimate playing career because he was, I know he only played 1 year in college, but he was a superstar for what we saw. The fact that led him to being a top 5 pick in the NFL draft, this isn't a situation where guys like this probably have things like this happen to them in their career very often. So the way that someone is going to respond to this is a great testament to, I would love to know, inside that circle there in Indianapolis, like what the brain trust feel like he can handle mentally as a kid. Because to get benched, I mean, this can be one of those things that we've seen quarterbacks not handle situations like this very well. I'm going to really hope, I really want to hope that this was just like a nice reset for him. Okay, you know what? It happened. It started out rough. Not everything is on him. Let's find a way to just be able to settle into the stuff that you do well. You know, we were failing you, Anthony.
Sure, yeah.
Like, let's get back to the things that you do well, like you're talking about, to be able to have those situations. But it doesn't give me any greater confidence in Michael Pittman. Stoked to be able to see that he's back at practice, right?
Yeah,
so, like,
in
we're
full.
assuming he's going to start, so that's going to be a thing. Josh Downs moves way down our list, though. Josh Downs becomes a low-end wide receiver 3 for us.
Yeah, so that would be a low-end wide receiver 3.
And I'm not, if you had to take a dart on either Alec Pierce or Adonai Mitchell, the answer is neither.
Probably Alec Pierce, only because if Michael Pittman Jr. plays, A.D. Mitchell's going to play a very limited number of snaps.
I don't want either one of them, though.
Yeah, of course. It's a big detriment to this passing game in general. So I don't think that one game on Sunday is the end-all, be-all for Anthony Richardson.
No.
If he plays well, that tells us he's back and this is the start of something special. If he plays poorly, it means like he's over, he's done with. But I do think this game will be telling just from like a mental makeup standpoint. If he goes out there and has learned nothing and is as error-prone as he was prior to being benched, we got a real problem on our hands.
Yep.
If he goes out there, looks sharp, even if the numbers are just okay, I think the Colts are saying to themselves, all right, it's now our responsibility to figure this out for the players' well-being long term.
Yep, I'm with you on that.
Wide receiver, other side, you want to talk
Yeah,
about?
let's really quickly talk about that on the other side of this, because I think you look at both of these wide receivers here for the Jets, and it's Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams. Here's the thing. You don't need to feel good about them and this offense to feel good about the volume that they're still getting, right? Like, I don't love how their production has worked out with Aaron Rodgers. That, to be honest, Garrett Wilson has been
He's been fine.
fine.
Yeah. He's coming off a bad game, but he's been fine.
Like, yeah, honestly, when you look at him, yeah, he's not the one that I'm worried about here. Wilson, wide receiver 8 in fantasy points per game, week 8, which is when we were able to see Davante Adams come over to this team. Davante Adams, wide receiver 27. However, both of them are top 10 in receptions over that span, and Adams in the last 3 games is 5th in targets. I mean, Davante Adams being 5th in targets, you're like, yeah, of course I'm starting Davante Adams, and that's the conversation, right? I don't feel as confident as I did initially, but both of them are still clear starters for me here in Week 11.
Yeah, it's a good matchup, too. 10th most fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, where the Colts rank right now. Both guys inside my top 10, Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams. And I was thinking about this because, and I get it, they're frustrating. They're a bit of yo-yo players right now. This entire Jets offense is kind of a yo-yo offense. But I was thinking about it because they're like, man, that's a ton of volume for 2 guys. Is there something that I haven't paid enough attention to this year for the Jets offense? And I figured out what it was. They're quietly, maybe not quietly, but they are at least somewhat surprisingly the 30th ranked rush offense this year. 30th.
Brutal.
They can't run the ball.
Yep.
So you have Breece Hall, you would think, when he ran brilliantly last year with a poor offensive line and no quarterback play or wide receivers, you'd be like, yeah, they can get the job done with much better circumstances this year. They can't.
Nope.
3rd worst rushing offense in the entire NFL. Breece Hall managers are like, yeah, we know, we get it. And that's why these 2 guys, these 2 wide receivers, are maintaining their value. So both top 10 options for me. Should be a good matchup. And I've got too many Jets fans in my life. I grew up too close to New York to know that you can't ever fully trust this team.
Yeah.
But there is a part of me that in the same way I am watching what Anthony Richardson is made of on Sunday afternoon, I'm watching what the Jets are made of. I know that there are probably Jets fans. We've got one. Where'd he go? 15 feet away.
Scott?
Scott just left. Scott was here a minute ago.
He was in here for just a minute. Our buddy Scott that works on the show for us.
Scott's a huge, we were talking about beforehand. And he's probably like, dude, like just stop trying to pretend there's hope. At the same time, like if they win on Sunday, they're 5-7, not that far out of the AFC playoff picture for that final spot, right? There are crazier things that could happen than a team finishing in that 7th spot, given the expanded playoff field. We're going to find out what this Jets team is made of. It's time for them to show up and be the offense that you would think you are getting when you have Aaron Rodgers or whatever is left of him, plus Davante Adams and Garrett Wilson.
Yeah. So both of those guys are going to be starters for us. You're still starting Breece Hall for what it's worth,
Yeah.
and Aaron Rodgers outside my top 16 at the quarterback spot. I would rather not do that. I do want to mention this really quickly, and we'll go through a couple of practice reports here real quick. But Devontae Adams did not practice on Wednesday with an illness.
Yeah.
Usually an illness on Wednesday doesn't make me nervous until I get closer to the
I
weekend.
think I heard also a wrist involved there, but no
Okay.
indications as of right now that he is not going to play on Sunday. They certainly need him.
Yeah. Let's dive into. I got a couple of practice reports.
Okay,
I
hit
just
me.
want to be real quick with them and have you tell me, should I be worried about this or should I not be worried about that? You mentioned yesterday, Trevor Lawrence officially out. Mac Jones is going to get the start this week against the Detroit Lions.
Good luck.
It's not going to be great.
Should not be ideal for them.
Nope.
That's correct, yes.
Najee Harris did not practice with an ankle injury
Had a
yesterday.
few DMPs on Wednesdays. This one does not alarm me as of yet.
Okay, great. So good to know that. A reminder as well,
Play the Ravens. Not ideal.
not ideal. Keon Coleman is out with a wrist injury. Amari Cooper, limited with a wrist injury that had him miss this last one. They're
concerned.
still concerned about that. It would be a big uptick for Khalil Shakir because I'm not sure who else they would throw the
Matt
football
Collins,
to.
yeah.
Exactly, yes, in that one. T. Higgins logged a limited practice with his quad. It feels like T is maybe trending towards playing this week.
Up, baby. I think T plays on Sunday night. It's a Sunday night game, so I'm very confident we will have early morning reporting. But if we don't, it's going to make things a bit trickier. I suspect we'll have a T. Higgins update, but at the latest Sunday morning.
Okay. Love seeing that it was limited at practice, though, and not a DNP for him.
true. Yep.
Unlike this next wide receiver, Tyreek Hill did not practice because of a wrist injury on Wednesday. This one, Stefania talked about it. We talked about it, trying to figure out what's it going to mean for Tyreek moving forward. But I don't love being able to see a DNP from him if that wrist really is becoming a problem.
Again, I just don't know. He played every snap. He had no drops, and he tackled Odell Beckham Jr. in the end zone. Maybe I'm being reductive here. Maybe I'm being the simple pea-brained guy that I can be sometimes. But if it was that concerning, would you do a WWE celebration?
I would not have, for what it's worth. We got 3 tight ends really quickly. Speaking of not just Amari Cooper and Keon Coleman, but Dalton Kincaid did not practice with a knee injury.
Nervous.
A little bit nervous about that one as well. George Kittle did not practice with a hamstring injury.
Nervous.
And I don't love that one either. And one more tight end, Sam Laporta did not practice because of the AC joint issue that he has. Stefania explained that. I'm also a little bit nervous about that, given the fact that they're playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, and if there was a week in which you could maybe rest a couple of guys if they had some problems, this would have been one of those weeks.
Right. Less nervous only because, A, he hasn't been that great this year, and B, this was kind of what Dan Campbell told us early in the week, right? There's been less clarity on George Kittle and Dalton Kincaid prior to yesterday, so we are certainly monitoring all those injuries that you just gave us. What do you know? It's week 11 and half the league is hurt.
Yeah, don't love that. All right, let's dive into some more game previews.
Alrighty.
Field. We just did the Colts and the Jets. Let's talk about the Green Bay Packers and the Chicago Bears.
Okay.
My guy, Jayden Reed. This one's interesting.
tricky. Yeah, it's
This
tricky.
one's a little tough for me. Coming off a bye, let's not forget that. Week 9, the last game that he played, 5 catches for 113 yards against the Lions. Double-digit fantasy points in 6 games this year, including 13.7 or more in 5 of those. But he's one of those guys that just doesn't get the volume that I need him to get. Only 1 game with more than 6 targets this year. And if the rushing efficiency is downfield, I have him as a low-end wide receiver 3 or a flex consideration this week. How are you approaching Jay?
I've got him as wide receiver 31, so a few more factors on top of what you just described. The Bears, for all the things that they have not done well on offense, continue to do something very well on defense. They don't allow wide receiver fantasy points. As a matter of fact, number 1, fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, the Chicago Bears. They have been excellent in that regard. The sledding gets tougher going forward as they face the likes of Justin Jefferson and Amon-Ra St. Brown and all the Packers wide receivers twice. That being said, they have been very good in that area. Meanwhile, Jayden Reed has just 2 top 20 finishes since week 1.
Yep.
So he hasn't had this maximum upside, and I think the large root of that, Daniel, is what you talked about. Volume, right? Over his past 5 games, how many catches?
Last 5 games, I'm going to say 30 catches.
19.
That's not.
So under 4 catches a game is very hard for any player to sustain, definite starting value unless it's Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Yeah. He's wide receiver 31 for me. Really good player. Still my preferred Packers wide receiver. But for all the things that we talked about during the offseason of this guy could be the sleeper, this guy could be the sleeper, this guy could be the sleeper, there was also the alternative scenario where they become like the Bears. No one gets enough to be a lineup block every single week.
Yeah, it's kind of what it feels like right now. He's the one, though, that would be leading the pack in that Packers offense. Let's talk about the Bears on the other side of this, because I think everyone else, we're starting Josh Jacobs at the running back spot this week. The other wide receivers we've talked about all season long for the Green Bay Packers. Jayden Reed is clearly our top one inside the top 30. Everyone else is more of a dart throw. When you look at the Bears, I want to know, here's the question. All right, I'm going to give you some of these names. Are you starting them or are you not starting them? Just being that reductive about it, okay?
Go for it.
Are you starting Caleb Williams?
No.
Okay. Are you starting Keenan Allen or Rome Odunze?
No.
Okay. I'm not starting either one of them as well. The rankings reflect that for me. Are you starting DJ Moore?
I am going to define a starting wide receiver as a wide receiver inside my top 30.
Okay.
The answer is no. I am his wide receiver 32 is DJ Moore, who is ice cold right now, Diego.
Yes.
He started the season with 5 games of exactly 10 fantasy points or more. Not bad, right? Like, still startable.
Yep.
Hasn't had this crazy bonanza game this year. Remember that, was it 50-pointer against the Commanders last year? You love those. We haven't seen those. Over the past 4 games, 7.3 or fewer fantasy points.
Yep.
Why is that? 4 or fewer catches and 33 or fewer receiving yards in each of his last 4 games.
Gross.
The volume's bad. The offense is bad. The touchdown equity is low. They did make a coordinator change, and there's always the potential for some turnaround and the potential for some hope. Sometimes when you make a coordinator change, it's kind of like the only thing you can do to try and mask what is a terrible offense. Case in point would be the Raiders, who have made a coordinator change, and I'm not so sure they're going to be any better than they were prior to the coordinator change. So I am not confident that this Bears offense immediately turns things around. This Packers defense, by the way, not bad, and a very good streaming option.
Yeah. I feel like this is one of those spots where what I have here on my note is I'm potentially flexing him, but I'm okay if you want to bench DJ Moore if you have better options. And right now, and I'm going to mention this later on in the show around another wide receiver that we talk about as well, the wide receivers on bye this week are not nearly as, it doesn't take away as much from your lineup as like running backs or some of the other situations.
Yeah, I'd say this is like in a 10-team league, in order for DJ Moore to not be in a flex spot with 2 wide receivers, it would mean that like everybody just drafted the appropriately ranked wide receivers ahead of him, right? Like he's probably still going to squeak into a lineup in a 10-team league because there's somebody who probably like just totally crushed it and has like 5 of the top 30 wide receivers, right? And somebody else is probably sitting there scraping by with like 2 lock-em-in wide receivers and like DJ Moore versus a running back who might be compelling, but not as inspiring.
Yep.
Not that DJ's been particularly inspiring, but how about Keenan Allen? Some numbers to it, by the way. I will give you a guess. Most receiving yards by Keenan Allen in any game this season is
85.
44.
Okay.
44. He has 1 game with double-digit fantasy points. That 1 game was when he had 2 touchdowns against the Jaguars in London. We talked about this earlier in the week. If I were to make a transition for the Bears under this new offense, my goal would be to get more Rome Odunze involved. I'm not sure that is going to happen. You can't just kick Keenan Allen to the curb. The reality for the Bears coaching staff, and I'm sure they know this, is that they are all coaching for their jobs, so they will probably do whatever they think gives them the best chance to win. I think Keenan Allen will continue to have a prominent role, just not a prominent fantasy outlook.
Bears have played 9 games this year. You said Keenan Allen has 1 game over 10 fantasy points.
Correct, yes.
Rome Odunze has, I think, 2 games.
He has 2 games with at least 100 yards, so
With
he's got to be at least
points.
double-digit fantasy
Okay,
points.
so that's 3 games with double-digit fantasy points. DJ Moore, I think, his first 4 games, 5
All 5,
games?
yep.
Okay, so that's 8. So 8 of their 9 games, they've had at least 1 wide receiver hit double-digit fantasy points, just to show you like how bad, unfortunately, it's been. And you mentioned it coming into this. Like, we were so thrilled that Caleb was stepping into one of the best situations it felt like a rookie quarterback was going to have. We did not take into account how bad this offensive line was going to be nearly enough.
If I can be selfish and plug something for a second, if you're listening to this show or watching the show live at noon Eastern time, a new episode of First Draft drops, and Mel and I with Greeny redraft the top 10 picks of the 2024 NFL Draft. And the conversation is obviously most interesting surrounding the first 2 picks.
Absolutely.
We have some thoughts on what you just described. And maybe some ways that we, as analysts and just fans too, need to recalibrate what it means to have a great supporting cast around a quarterback. Because it turns out that, maybe that wide receiver versus offensive line debate is tilting in the favor of the offensive line a whole lot more heavily than we gave it credit for during the months leading up to the draft.
Yep. All right, we got one more guy in the Bears that we're talking about. DeAndre Swift. You starting him or are you not starting him?
Got him as RB20, so I guess a fringe starter.
He's a starter.
But I feel pretty good about him. I mean, he's had 17 or more opportunities. That's combined carries and targets in every game except for week 1. So, like, they've gotten him going. He's been fine. Sees decent work in the passing game. I feel pretty good about DeAndre Swift.
I do too. Over the last 5, forget last week. Last week was not great, right? The previous 5 games before that, running back 5 in scrimmage yards, running back 7 in receptions per game, running back 7 in fantasy points per game over that stretch. Like, he was on a heater. And then last week was just sort of a dud. Even with this team not playing well, DeAndre Swift has proven to be able to potentially have good volume and a fairly nice floor given not only the receiving game work that he gets, which is not as consistent as I would like, but he's had some really nice games from the pass catching perspective,
he's
as well
solid.
as fine
He's
in
fine.
the end zone.
Yeah,
So
he's fine.
let's dive into the Minnesota Vikings and the Tennessee Titans here. Is Calvin Ridley a lineup lock for you?
I think
now?
so. Yeah, I do. And it may be one of those where, like, it happened. Some of it happened late. He had a late touchdown against the Chargers last week, but still, those count, right?
Yes.
Let's talk about the volume for Calvin Ridley. He has 8 or more targets in 5 straight games.
And awesome.
Let's talk about the 3 games without DeAndre Hopkins, who, of course, wasn't playing a full-time role, but was playing enough and was clearly their second-best wide receiver on that roster. In the 3 games without DeAndre Hopkins, 20 catches on 33 targets. That's not even like an overwhelmingly dominant reception percentage, but it's a ton of volume and a lot of catches.
Yep.
He has at least 73 yards in each of those 3 games. He scored 2 touchdowns last week as well. This is going to be the wide receiver they target the most. On top of that, in part because they are often ahead, the Vikings have allowed the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Game script should be in his favor. Volume should be in his favor. And let's be honest, Daniel, we can say this when Mike's not around. Momentum's in his favor right now.
100%
right?
it is.
You want to be the guy that doesn't play Calvin Ridley?
No, I don't.
Yeah, I thought so too.
I'm very much in and I'm based on what he's done recently. That volume that you mentioned is just huge, which has been fantastic. Love to be able to see that. That's the kind of volume you expect the wide receiver that you're paying that kind of money to see. For what it's worth, you mentioned 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers. Vikings seem to give wide receivers, fantasy wide receivers, a really nice, comfortable floor. 16 different wide receivers have hit at least 11.2 fantasy points. You don't want 11.2 out of your wide receiver, but what you want less is like 5.6. I mean, the idea that 16 different wide receivers have hit at least 11 fantasy points just shows you the floor that you're going to get, it seems like, from the number 1 wide receiver.
I would agree, yeah.
In that other team's offense. All right, what about Aaron Jones this week? Kevin Seifert, who we love, tweeted out that Kevin O'Connell said he feels good about having him for Sunday's game. We're going to continue to watch that just to see if anything happens at practice that we need to be worried about. But it seems like he should be good to go for us.
It sounds like he'll play, and he's been really good this year, hasn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, he's got 19 touches per game this season.
That's great. That's great volume.
Great, really good volume, and also he has been a factor in the passing game. He has the 6th most receiving yards amongst all running backs this year. I think there's a chance that we see a little less of Aaron Jones on Sunday just because of that rib injury. This also could be a game that they're up big, right? And if they are up big, probably just let Cam Akers tote the rock. But I have him as RB17, still going to be a starter this week. Jacksonville does not scare me in any meaningful way. So, yes, Aaron Jones continues to kind of just cruise along. And just to reiterate, if he does play a little bit less, recent games have suggested that it is clearly Cam Akers as that number 2 running back in Minnesota.
Agreed.
If you have the roster depth and flexibility to make an insurance ad, I will be grabbing Cam Akers and not Ty Chandler right now.
I am with you on that. I do want to say this. Aaron Jones, to me, I feel like there is still more to this game to be in unlocked. I mean, I wish that I was more in on him coming into the season, but when you look at what he's done this year, 7 games with at least 11.5, 11.
I was going to say, what word is that?
11.
You're unlocking a new number?
Yeah, that's when Mike's not here, things are a
Unlock
little
new
looser.
numbers.
That's right.
Yeah.
11.5 fantasy points
Yep.
in 7 of his games this year. So again, it just showcases the high floor that he's getting, but a big part of that is because of what he's doing on the ground. He's getting 101.2 yards per game across the board, okay? So you're talking about a floor of like 10.
Insane, by the way.
10.1 fantasy points just from what you're doing from a yardage perspective. And when you look at what he's doing in the end zone, he only has 3 touchdowns this year. So you're telling me he's doing all the work, but he's not getting the payoff to be able to get into the end zone. Mike Clay has the strength of schedule getting easier for Vikings running backs. It went from the 21st hardest to the 12th easiest. So it feels like if Aaron Jones can ever start finding pay dirt, to match the production that he's getting from a yardage perspective. I just feel like there's more to potentially unlock in his game towards the second half of the season.
Would be sweet. Hopefully, and if he stays healthy, he should be money in the
That's what you're hoping for.
Yep.
All right, let's dive ahead and talk a little bit more about the Las Vegas Raiders and the Miami Dolphins.
New play caller alert, baby.
What are the expectations do you have here? So for when you're talking about the Raiders, they did make a statement. We're going to stick with Gardner Minshew. That is clear, all right? We're not making a quarterback change. I mean, he's a good wide receiver on a team that just doesn't score a lot of points.
This is Jacoby Myers.
Yes, we're talking about Jacoby Myers. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. I don't know what other wide receiver would be talking about in that Raiders offense.
Turns out we are not talking about Trey Tucker. Jacoby's been solid, especially in the weeks without Devontae Adams. I know that Devontae was traded more recently than 5 full games ago, but he was missing time with that hamstring injury. Prior to being traded. So there are 5 games, over the last 5 games that Jacoby Myers has played. They just had their bye this past week, of course. 46 targets. That's
great.
Over 9 a game. That's really good for Jacoby Myers. And oh, by the way, he has at least 9.9 fantasy points in each of those games. In several of those cases, it's a few more than 9.9. So I know 9.9, to your point just a moment ago, it's not like you're hoping to sign up for 9.9, but not the worst floor for the number 1 wide receiver in an offense that will once again have Gardner Minshew under center, as you just alluded to. I have no idea if there will be an appreciable difference in the play calling with Norv Turner / Scott Turner as opposed to Luke Getsy, who is the play caller who was fired at the beginning of their bye week. But I would hope that if part of the process during the bye was to self-scout, they would say, oh, our 2 best pass catchers are Brock Bowers and Jacoby Myers. Let's just keep throwing the football their way.
Yeah, that's going to be, it feels like, that offense from a passing game perspective. I just feel like if you have, again, I mentioned this and I'm going to say it more, with where the wide receiver position is at from a bye week perspective, I likely am going to have like a full gamut of the wide receivers available on my roster. So I don't feel like Jacoby Myers is a must start or someone you need to start. But if you need to, and you're in that situation, I don't have a problem starting him with him.
Wide receiver 22, so maybe a little more confident than what
Really?
you said. Yeah.
Okay.
What do you have, Matt? Do you know?
I'm a little bit lower than that. I'd have to look. Let me pull it up here.
Whatever.
While I talk about this next one. The same conversation to me goes for Tyreek Hill. I want to know, I think we see Tyreek Hill similarly, but maybe slightly differently. Is he a must start for you this week, or is he someone that you can start this week? Do you know the difference? There's a difference, right?
I do know the difference. My ranking would suggest he's a must start. But I sort of I'm now hedging a little bit emotionally, right?
Are you emotionally okay with that? Yeah.
I don't know, because I was the one I was the one that was. I think you and I agree, because both Mike and Stefania used the same reference of like, hey, this is a yes or no. Are you starting him or are you not starting him?
Yeah.
Regardless of where you have him ranked. And I was like, I'm not so sure that's the case. And I think you are also not so sure that's the case.
That's where yes.
All right, so here's a little bit more context, because I think you hear, oh, they're playing the Raiders. Of course he could have a big day. He could have a big day against Deion Sanders in his prime. It's Tyreek Hill, right? Like the possibility of a big play or a big day is always on the board. The Raiders, perhaps not as bad against the pass as you might think. 11th fewest passing yards per game allowed.
I was surprised when I was looking at these numbers yesterday.
They're like mid-pack against opposing wide receivers.
Yeah.
Maybe even slightly above average. Sometimes it's hard to go and further parse that out. Is that because, well, teams are always playing with a lead against the Raiders? That probably contributes to it some. But I don't think this is like facing off against the Baltimore Ravens or the Cincinnati Bengals, where you're saying to yourself, yeah, this is a decided advantage for the passing game, as opposed to where things are at with the Raiders. So, yeah, I think it's an okay matchup for Tyreek Hill, but not enough that you're saying to yourself, like, okay, a big day is a formality, right? Like, it should come as zero surprise whatsoever. And there is a part of me that would say, like, yeah, the Dolphins probably realize, like, they need to get Tyreek Hill going.
Yeah. Yes.
They need to get the entire offense going.
Everyone's
right?
gotta
So
get
it's
going.
not like, this is not like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy where it's like, yeah, we're doing everything except for getting this guy involved. Right? Like, here's the one player we got to fix. No, like, they need to get Jalen Waddle going. Everybody except for, like, basically Devon Achane and Jonnu Smith needs to get going.
Feels like, man, maybe this isn't the right analogy, but like to me, that's kind of where Marvin Harrison Jr. in that Cardinals offense is.
That's a good one, yeah.
Enough of the Cardinals offense is doing stuff. James Conner's crushing. Trey McBride is still great. Like, but that's the one guy that we got to get unlocked here, and it does feel that way with Tyreek Hill. For what it's worth, I have Jacoby Myers at wide receiver 30, so I'm a little bit lower. You're at wide receiver 22. Here's where I'm at.
Okay, let me hear you.
With Tyreek Hill.
Let me hear you.
Like,
let me hear you.
Yes, absolutely. You can start Tyreek Hill, and if the projections show you as being down by a good amount and you know you're going to need some points, don't be silly and not play him over someone that is clearly not a better wide receiver than him.
Okay.
But I think that I am emotionally at the point where if you tell me, you know what, Calvin Ridley has been cruising lately. How do I not play Calvin Ridley over Tyreek Hill? Then I get that.
This is good.
If you tell me that Cedric Tillman, who has 3 straight games of over 18.5 fantasy points on a team that you know is going to throw the ball a ton with Jameis under center, then yes, you can start him over Tyreek Hill. I'm emotionally at the point where if he goes off against the Raiders, who have been better against wide receivers like you mentioned, then I'm okay with not having him in my starting lineup because I'm tired of starting Tyreek Hill thinking I'm going to get 20 fantasy points and getting a very, very modest 11, 12, 13 from that standpoint. For what it's worth, Raiders have given up 6 games to wide receivers over 11.4 fantasy points. 11.4. Okay? Only 6 guys have reached that mark. That's wide receiver 39. If you were to look at that, 11.4 fantasy points per game.
That's not
wide
bad at all.
receiver 39. That means that there are...
They're not bad on defense.
Correct.
Yeah.
So you're telling me that Tyreek Hill, who's been around that number each of the last 3 games, I can't find potentially 39 other wide receivers, including some on the back end of my roster, that maybe I like the matchup or the the trend that's been going on for some of these other guys. So, like I said, if you're projected to lose and you need a bigger game, Tyreek Hill's the guy you need to go for, but I'm very okay with benching Tyreek Hill for somebody else that you feel like has been rolling lately.
Tyler, if you can hear me, our great producer Tyler, if you can hear me, I'd be curious if the chat, if there's a way to like get this conversation going in the YouTube chat right now. And I don't know if we can create polls on YouTube. Can you do that?
I think we can do that.
Okay, you can. All right. Because I think I'm going to heavily consider both your stance and the chat stance on this dilemma that I am facing myself.
Okay.
I've got a non-PPR league where I have to start 3 receivers, one of which is A.J. Brown. I feel like he's in his, like, we're playing A.J. Brown.
Correct.
That's one of the rules here, right? I don't think anybody would disagree with that.
Nope.
All right, so I've got 2 other wide receiver spots. And here are the options. Again, non-PPR. Tyreek Hill.
Yep.
Courtland Sutton.
Oof.
Calvin Ridley.
Yeah.
Jawan Jennings. And Amari Cooper. Cooper, obviously, is a question mark to play. So I gave you 5 players for 2 spots. One more time. Tyreek Hill, Courtland Sutton, Calvin Ridley, Jawan Jennings, Amari Cooper.
We just mentioned the tear that Calvin Ridley has been on and the volume that he's seen. You know what Tyreek Hill isn't seeing in the last 3 games?
Volume?
Volume.
Yeah.
Volume. Courtland Sutton has been crushing it. I think he's over 17.5 fantasy points in each of the last 3 games that he's had as well. So that is the ultimate, like, emotional test of where are you at. And if you ask me which one of these guys has the chance for a 35-point game, we all know it's Tyreek Hill. But are you emotionally prepared that if that does happen and you bench Tyreek, can you be okay with it?
Probably not. I'll probably cry.
Okay.
If we're being honest. All right, so
I'd rather start one of those other 2 guys.
But I
would love to know
I have 2 spots.
Yes.
I got 2 spots. So you're going with
Courtland Sutton, Calvin Ridley, A.J. Brown.
Okay. Courtland Sutton, Calvin Ridley, A.J. Brown.
Yep.
Tyler, maybe I don't know if the chat. Okay, so let's put Amari Cooper off to the side here for a second because I think Cooper he's probably iffy for me anyways because of the injury and the matchup here. So it's Calvin Ridley, Jawan Jennings, Courtland Sutton, and Tyreek Hill.
Yep.
There's a part of me that may be influenced a little bit by what happens tonight with A.J. Brown.
Yeah.
If A.J. Brown goes ham, you might sit there and say to yourself, like, I think you just – and I'm facing off against Saquon. All right, so this guy's the guy I'm playing against as a good team here for sure. So it might be one of those where it's like if Saquon races out to a 10-point lead on A.J. Brown, non-PPR, so our totals are often lower than PPR.
Correct.
You might have to recalibrate this. But it's a fascinating – and it's actually not fascinating. You know what it is, people? It's devastating. You know why?
Tell me why.
Because you never choose right.
That's exactly
how
how it
fantasy
works.
football works. You never choose like, ooh, it turns out that like of these 5, 2 were clearly better than the rest, and I definitely, unequivocally, only consider them. That's not how it works.
No.
That's never how it works.
No.
I don't think that I've had in recent weeks, because this was a recent trade for Tyreek Hill, and with some injuries to Cooper and injuries to A.J. Brown, I haven't had, and Juwan Jennings, and Jennings carrying much more value in the post-Brandon Ayuk world. Like I don't think I've had a matchup where it was like I was on the fence between 2 guys and choosing the wrong one cost me that matchup. But it's like one of those, like I think about this lineup decision probably more than any other in any league that I play in.
Which makes a ton of sense. I mean, he's Tyreek Hill. He was wide receiver 1 in our ESPN ADP, and we're talking about potentially sitting him behind 2 guys that, like you told me in week 11, with Tua still under center.
Yeah.
That we would maybe be thinking about benching Tyreek Hill. It's one of like the biggest dilemmas I feel like right now in fantasy football. I don't think it's as big of a dilemma on Jalen Waddle. For what it's worth, if you were chat and it's early returns is
Benching those 2, or they're playing them?
they're benching.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so we would be
A.J. Brown was already locked
benching-
in, so it's
yeah.
Calvin Ridley and Juwan Jennings. Okay.
They have 44% benching Tyreek Hill for what it's worth. We'll continue to monitor that. Maybe at the end of the show, we'll come back to it, see where we're at on this one.
Okay.
I do not have as much trust in Jalen Waddle. Since his wide receiver 16 finish in week 1 field, he has been outside the top 39 every single week, including 6 of the last 7 games. He's been outside the wide receiver 45 mark. 6 of his last 7 outside top 45. And we just mentioned the matchup is not even good. Of course, that means he is going to be the wide receiver in this offense to go off because we're saying don't bench him in the
57 or fewer yards in every game since
Nope.
week 1.
No, thank you.
For all these things, like for all these fantasy things here we're talking about with this Dolphins passing game and the wide receivers, they do play over the next 2 weeks at home, the Raiders and the Patriots. Good opportunity to get back to 5-6, and they will be hanging around in that AFC's race for the 7th place finish.
All right, let's move ahead and talk about the Cleveland Browns and the New Orleans Saints. I just mentioned one of the guys that I would like to play in front of Tyreek Hill, and it's Cedric Tillman. In case you forgot, because of the bye, week 7, he had 12 targets, 8 catches for 81 yards, 18.1 fantasy points. Week 8, 9 targets, 7 receptions for 99 yards and 2 touchdowns, 28.9 fantasy points. Week 9, 11 targets, 6 receptions for 75 yards, and he found the end zone in that one as well, 19.5 fantasy points. Dude was crushing it. 3 weeks prior to the bye, Saints have given up the 7th most fantasy points wide receivers and some pretty big performances to the wide receiver spot. How are you approaching him given the volatility of this Browns offense?
Like, at what point do you start to trust a guy who in the first year and a half of his career did nothing?
It's a great question.
And then all of a sudden broke out. It has 3 games of just massive success.
Now, for what it's worth, this happens all the time where we see wide receivers or just players have like this pocket in the middle of a season and then they disappear back into the ether.
It happens all the time, yeah.
I'm trying to project that not for...
Right. I've got him as wide receiver 30 on Cedric Tillman. And the reason why he wouldn't be higher, there's actually 2 reasons. One is like eventually the comeback down to earth game is going to happen, right? And when that comeback down to earth game does happen, it might be like crashing back down to earth.
Could be.
Coming back down to earth.
Yep.
Second is the Browns in each of those 3 games that Cedric Tillman went off were playing super high scoring shootouts. Do you expect that against the Saints, who right now have the thinnest wide receiver room in the entire NFL?
I don't expect a shootout, no. I mean, I do expect them to let Jameis do what Jameis does.
What does that even mean? I don't even know what that means.
You know what? That's a great
knows what that
question.
means.
No, I mean,
Provocative. It gets the people going.
it gets the people going, Field.
It does, yeah.
I love you. No, there's a part of me that just feels like it's the volume. I mean, you look at the idea, 12 targets, 9 targets, 11 targets. That volume that we've seen over the last 3 weeks, I do want to know, coming out of the bye, is he still the wide receiver 1 of this offense, or is it going to be Jerry Jeudy? Is it going to be Elijah Moore? Is it going to be David Njoku as the number 1 pass catcher here?
I would like it to be David Njoku because selfishly, I want that. Like a lot of us drafted David Njoku, not super high, but, as a starting tight end. Rather than adding those other 3 guys off of the waiver wire, most likely, and Tillman and Jeudy and Elijah Moore.
I've got Cedric Tillman at wide receiver 22. You've got him at wide receiver 30.
Ooh, so we have
Jacoby Myers.
Yeah, that's
at
a
wide
good
receiver 22, and I have him at wide receiver 30. You want to do a board bet?
heads-up board bet right
Yeah,
now. Huh?
straight up.
Okay, I say Jacoby Myers outscores Cedric Tillman in Week 11.
And I say Cedric Tillman outscores Jacoby Myers in Week 11. Put it on the board.
Put it on the board.
Nice.
Like that.
Right
That'll be a
there.
fun
All right.
one. That's probably the biggest thing that I'm looking at in this offense. Do you have Nick Chubb as a startable running back, given all the running backs that we do have on bye? Because there's a handful of them.
26 for me. He's like about as low as you can get in terms of starting running backs and where I have them ranked this week. Meaning starting running backs as in like the starter for his own team.
Correct.
Great story. Good matchup. The Saints have allowed the 4th most fantasy points to opposing running backs.
Yep.
In 3 games this season, Nick Chubb has 2.6 fantasy points as a receiver.
That's bad.
He needs a touchdown to pay off.
Yes. Yes.
Understandably, he has not been nearly as explosive early on in his return. He's coming off of a massive knee injury. Jerome Ford could play some snaps this week.
Yep.
Deontay Foreman could play some snaps this week. Who knows? Foreman could be a healthy scratch, but the bottom line is like they are healthier at running back around Nick Chubb than they were going into the bye. Hard for me to get on board here.
This wide receiver, this running back 26 to me, just like talking it through out loud. James Conner's on a bye. He'd be higher than top 25.
Yep.
Tyrone Tracy on a bye.
Yep.
He'd be higher than top 25. Seattle on a bye?
They're back.
Who's the 4th team? I know
Lions, Panthers, Chuba Hubbard.
there you go, Chuba Hubbard. Definitely would be higher than running back 25. So he's at least wide receiver 29 if those 3 guys were, or running back 29.
Yep.
I did it again.
Yep.
And then you also have both of the Bucks running backs, which like I could make a case that both of them.
Both of them over him, yeah.
So,
It feels sort of like Alexander Madison-y or where we had Zamir White before he got benched, that sort of range.
And with it not being a situation in this, like you have projected, if this isn't a shootout where Jameis has to get them down to the goal line, like it feels like there might be less touchdown upside because of that. Like I don't want them grinding it out in the middle of the field. I want them to have shots to get in the end zone.
Yeah, I feel the same way. So yeah, it sucks, and I feel like I feel a little bit uncomfortable, like saying less
Feel bad
than
saying
awesome
it.
things about Nick Chubb
I know,
because he rules.
I know.
But I would say that's about how I see it this week.
Last question here. Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
We've been down this road so many times. He is wide receiver 57 for me this week.
I'm going to say the stat that I said last time when we talked about this. He had more fantasy points in Week 10 last week than he had in his previous 15 games combined.
So mark me down, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, top 8 wide receiver in Week 9 of 2025.
Of next year, exactly.
Mark
exactly.
that one down, people.
It's not great.
Or whatever 15 games is from right now.
All right, we got another game here. We're going to dive into the Rams taking on the New England Patriots field. You just mentioned a little first draft promo. We're doing a redraft of the top 10. Does Drake May factor into that, and how do you feel about him at this point in his career?
Yeah, he does factor into that very prominently in that redraft. He will not be going any lower than where he went in the real draft. Showing a lot of signs of promise here is Drake May, to the point that some people are considering streaming him this week. I'm not quite there yet, Daniel. I've got him as quarterback 14. After tonight, he'll move up to quarterback 12 with both Jayden Daniels and Jalen Hurts removed. There is an easy path for Drake May to be a much more fantasy-relevant quarterback. It would be if the Patriots gave him one opportunity as a design runner.
Yeah.
He has 0 rushing yards, 0 on designed quarterback runs this season.
Everything has been just scrambles out of the
All
pocket.
scrambles. And the scrambles are very helpful for fantasy, and he is an outstanding scrambler.
Yep.
He had a game with 95 rushing yards a few weeks ago.
Yep.
He had an 18-yard rushing touchdown. Like, I'm from Boston. I've been watching Patriots quarterbacks my entire life. Like, I never saw an 18-yard rushing touchdown, right? Like, Brady and Bledsoe had a combined 18 yards rushing for their entire career.
Yeah.
So there's some real upside here if the Patriots uncork that aspect of Drake May's skill set. But because of the lack of design runs, I have him as quarterback 14 as opposed to a little bit higher.
Okay.
How about you?
I got him at quarterback 10. Rams have given up the 13th fewest points to the position. You know, you'd love to see it be on the other side of that. They're not great, but I'd love to see it, a little bit of an easier matchup. And you mentioned this, the way that he utilizes his legs. I mean, the team has won 2 of the last 3 games, which, like, from a Patriots perspective, you love to see. He has had some nice days. 20.8 fantasy points against the Jags. You love to be able to see that. 19.5 against the Texans. That's a nice one.
For sure.
And then you mentioned the 95-yard rushing game. That was 15.7 fantasy points against the Titans. Man, it's hard when you get 95 rushing yards and still only have 15.7 fantasy points because it means you really didn't do anything as a passer in that game.
That was the game he had 3 turnovers.
Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, which he's got 4 turnovers over his last 2 games. He's got to be a little bit more protective with the football. Again, I think there's a chance within the next 2 years we're talking about Drake May as a pretty steady top 10 quarterback option with better wide receivers and a little bit more rushing design nature, but not quite there yet for Drake May.
We just need more help for Drake May.
T. Higgins would look awesome in a Patriots.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry, Bengals fans, that was triggering. But it's a free agent. I call the true blue free agents, like Christian Wilkins this past year, Xavier McKinney this past year, guys who reached the open market not because their team didn't want them back, but because their team was strapped in a way with cap space that they just couldn't make a compelling enough offer. Wilkins was great prior to getting hurt, and Xavier McKinney has been awesome. That would be the T. Higgins this upcoming year. He will be, I can't imagine, much more than 26 years old. He's 5 years into his career, plenty of good football ahead, capable of being a number 1 wide receiver. T. Higgins would be a great, pretty much any team that needs a wide receiver. He'd be a great fit there, but the Patriots do scream T. Higgins suitor to me.
Let me ask you this question, and I'm going to just jump away from this game real quick. You mentioned just wide receivers that will be free agents. We just watched the 49ers pay Brandon Ayuk $30 million for a very long amount of time. We have the guy that Ricky Pearsall just drafted in the first round, and George Kittle is still in this offense with CMC.
Ron Jennings.
Is this going to be a situation where Debo potentially moves on from San Francisco, or are they going to be able to have enough in their cap space bucket to bring him back as well?
Oh, probably not. I mean, it's going to have to be somebody that goes.
But it can't be Brandon Ayuk, right? And it's not going to be the guy that
could be Ayuk, but it's going to be a lot harder now that he's hurt.
And I would assume that's just a ton of money for another team to be able to swallow.
Yeah, here's how I'll leave it, is people who are around the NFL, who meticulously study the salary cap of every team, fundamentally believe San Francisco cannot continue to afford all their players starting next year.
Okay.
This year they're fine, obviously, but Brock Purdy will make $55 to $60 million a year starting next year.
Jumping up from $580,000
jumping up from minimum wage, yes. So that's going to cost. That's going to chip away at just the overall salary structure.
Of course.
And this has always been viewed, meaning this is in the 2025 offseason, as a pivot point offseason for San Francisco. That's going to come with some tough but necessary business decisions. It's a byproduct of crushing it in the draft. They've done an amazing job finding blue chip talent. And if there is a downside to that, it's what's about to happen at some point, probably this offseason.
I would love to be able to see Drake May with either a guy like Debo or T. Higgins, or find one of these other wide receivers that is not a bad wide receiver. Their team just doesn't have the ability to keep them, fortunately.
That's the way to go. Yep.
All right. Let's talk one more thing. On the other side of this,
Yeah.
feels like we're going to need a little bit of a shadow. Mike, if Mike were here, he'd probably be talking about a shadow report a little bit with Christian Gonzalez. Are you a Cooper Kupp guy in Week 11, or are you a Puka Nacua guy in Week 11?
Yes, I'm both.
Okay.
Well, I'm just both every week, probably. I think there's actually a chance we could see some Puka on Christian Gonzalez, or Christian Gonzalez on Puka, I should say. But let's just talk about Cooper Kupp, who's my wide receiver 13 this week, and Puka's even higher than that. The volume is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Cooper Kupp has played less than 4.5 games because he's played 4 full and he left early in the first half, or before the first half, I should say, in the game against Arizona when he got hurt. He's got 51 targets, Daniel. I mean, we're talking about 10 plus a game. So that's 4.5 is probably that's 11.5, 12 targets a game for Cooper Kupp. You're playing him every week. You feel good about it. Let it rip with Cooper Kupp. Let it rip.
You've got Kupp at wide receiver 11 and wide receiver 13, so you have Kupp just ahead of Puka. But, I mean, they're both
I
obviously.
thought it was reverse. I'm sorry. But whatever it is, yeah.
I've got Puka at wide receiver 8, Kupp at wide receiver 9, and Puka's 2 full games this year.
Yeah, he's awesome. He freaking rules.
18.1 and 18.8 fantasy points. Week 1, he left early against the Lions with the injury. Then he got thrown out for throwing a punch in another game. Yeah. So, in his 2 full games, the idea that he was top 15 in both of them, hitting at least 18 fantasy points in both those games, it just feels like, yes, like you said, we're in on both of them.
Yeah.
I don't even know. It feels disingenuous to be like, which one do you like more? I like them both. It kind of just feels like.
Matter, right? It's these are both. These, I believe, are yes or no questions.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think they're both yes. You're starting both.
Very strong yeses too. We're not even on the fringe there with that one. All right.
Agreed.
Let's dive into a Thursday Night Football preview.
Yeah.
We got the Commanders taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. We got to talk about the running backs here for the Commanders. Field Yates, Brian Robinson, back at practice, full practice, does not have an injury designation. You love to be able to hear that. For what it's worth, Austin Eckler's recent stretch without Brian Robinson Jr., 17.3 and 18.1 fantasy points. Both of those games he had a touchdown.
Yeah.
He's crushed it without Brian Robinson Jr. there. I don't think that B-Rob has lost that RB1 job, but I do feel like this is as much of a committee as it probably was earlier on in the season, where Austin Eckler is going to get 7, 8, 9, 10 touches a game because that's just what he's been doing in this backfield.
And on top of that, B-Rob misses this past week. That was, 3 days ago, 4 days ago now? It's not like this is him returning after, hey, he was out 2 weeks ago and then he played a little bit last week and he's now going to be a full go. No, like 4 days ago he wasn't healthy enough to play. Now, are we expecting him to play a ton of snaps? Yeah, I mean, a meaningful number for sure. He's my RB24 this week, is Brian Robinson. But over the last 3 games that he played, 46% of the snaps or fewer. Maybe the number climbs to 55 tonight. I don't think this is an 80% of the snaps game for Brian Robinson, in part because they are not utilizing him as a pass catcher this year. Over his last 3 games, he has 1 catch on 1 target for 11 yards. Wow. Remember last year, he really thrived as this receiving touchdown specialist.
Yeah.
On top of his rushing, too. But he was awesome in the passing game last year. You sign Austin Eckler, you have a different offense. No surprise that has gone down a little bit for B-Rob. So he's RB24 for me, kind of on that border of being a starter in 10-team leagues.
I couldn't see it any better than you did, Field. There's a
going
part
differently.
to me. No, I'm not going differently. I agree with you. He's running back 24. There's just a part that, like, when I look at this, I want to be so much higher on Brian Robinson than I actually am. Like, when I have to make that decision because Austin Eckler is not going away. Jeremy McNichols is going to siphon away a couple of touches.
Yeah.
Like, it's just there is another body in that backfield that's taking opportunities away from Brian Robinson Jr. Not to mention, even though we haven't seen it over the last 5 weeks, that you have a mobile quarterback that is going to have some designed runs as well. It's just one of those backfields that there's so many different people that have opportunities to be able to touch the ball. It's just the ceiling on Brian Robinson Jr. is just lower than a lot of the other running backs that I feel like we have in that area because it just gets spread out to so many different people in that offense.
Yeah, totally. And just for those that are listening and not watching, our lineup blocks for this game were Jayden Daniels and Terry McLaurin on the Commanders side.
Yep.
On the Eagles side, no surprise, Jalen Hurts, Devontae Smith,
Yep.
A.J. Brown,
Yep.
Saquon Barkley. I'm not that concerned about the Eagles guys having a down game. And I'm not concerned enough to the point that I'm benching Jayden Daniels or Terry McLaurin, but worth watching here. The Commanders have been an incredible story. If I'm not mistaken, they are now 7-0 against teams with losing records and 0-3 against teams with winning records.
Really?
We have not seen quite as efficient and prolific of an offense of late as we did early in the season. So, not to the point of benching them, but if you get 17 tonight from Jayden Daniels, not going to stun me. Could he get you 27? Of course he can. But this is a tough test tonight. This Eagles defense has totally turned things around.
Yep.
They've been super stingy against opposing wide receivers. So, again, all of those players are still in my lineups. I'm merely noting that, like, you are on a bit of notice for the possibility of a more average game as opposed to a dominant game.
I feel I know I need to emotionally prepare for that, Field Yates, for what it's worth. There's a part of me that if I get 17.5 from Jayden Daniels, I just feel like even if I get 16 fantasy points, I feel like my mark, if I start a quarterback, I'm looking for my floor of 16. If I get 16 and above,
You're good?
I'm good. Okay. Like, I'm not always as
Jayden
happy
gets
as I would be, but like 16 is like, that's the mark. If I start getting into like the 14s, 15s, 13s, like I'm a little disappointed. But 16 is a really nice floor.
I think that's happening, don't you?
I do think that he gets to 16 fantasy points. And by the way, like, this is one of those guys, like, we still haven't seen the ceiling for Jayden Daniels. I think that, like, Jayden Daniels has
Some banana stuff early in the season, right?
We did see some banana stuff, but like, I think he's got, 35, 40-point upside in his game when he does some of the things that he does. Like, I don't know if he's going to get it this week.
Yeah.
But like, I still feel like there's so much more to unlock from Jayden Daniels' games, in part because not only is he a great runner, but when you saw him utilizing his legs at the goal line, if we can get back to that being a thing, I know that's contrary to what we just talked about with Brian Robinson Jr., but like, if he can become that quarterback again,
That'd be awesome.
that would be fantastic. I will say, If you want to have a little bit of extra fun here, we got a fantasy-focused parlay that you can dive into at ESPN Bet. It's Dallas Goedert over 40 receiving yards, Devontae Smith over 50 receiving yards, and Terry McLaurin over 60 receiving yards. The odds on that was plus 600, is now plus 750. One more time. Dallas Goedert over 40 receiving yards, Devontae Smith over 50 receiving yards, and Terry McLaurin over 60 receiving yards. Heading over to ESPN Bet.
Like it.
To have a little bit extra fun doing the game in that one. I got to be honest, Field, if I'm looking at this, I'm going to pull it up right now on ESPN Bet. What do you think the line is for Jalen Hurts to have 2 or more anytime touchdowns, given the touchdown streak he has been on recently? I mean, if you're going to tell me
it's
something's
hard to do for somebody.
It's hard to do for anyone.
Anybody. I'm going to go plus 250.
When I pull this up right now and I look at touchdown scores, it feels to me like, it's going to take a minute. It's going to take me a minute. Okay. Sorry.
Who are you taking in this game tonight? I'm picking the Eagles just for the record.
I'm just taking the Eagles for what it's worth. I feel like
I'm taking the Eagles tonight. Jalen Hurts has 8 rushing touchdowns in his past 4 games. What an absolute tear he is on. Remember, he was bad, air quotes, last week. His worst game in his past 3 when he had 29.68 fantasy points. I'm just talking to myself right now. Will Jalen Hurts have over 25 fantasy points tonight? The answer is probably. It's going to feel awesome. And A.J. Brown, you're going to carry your weight. Saquon, I've got too much investment in you elsewhere to not want you to ball out. But in that league I was just telling you guys about. Hey, maybe Tyler, can we revisit the poll results from the YouTube chat?
Plus 500.
Plus 500?
You said plus 250.
Yeah, I was low.
So,
wow.
I don't know. I might take it. You want to throw he's been crushing it. It is really awesome. Difficult to be able to do. Of course, this is the week that I'm going to make this anytime touchdown bet.
Yep.
And Saquon Barkley is going to go off for 3 rushing touchdowns.
Yeah,
That's
totally.
exactly what it's going to be. That's how that works. Yeah, let's go back to the bet. All right, or the poll.
Okay.
So,
being benched. Yep.
Cortland Sutton, the options were A.J. Brown, who we're starting, Tyreek Hill, Cortland Sutton, and Calvin Ridley. Right now, chat, it looks like A.J. Brown and Calvin Ridley are the 2 must-starts. The 2 that they're considering benching most are Tyreek Hill and Cortland Sutton, with Cortland Sutton leading.
So basically,
the bench.
Sutton. Okay, so they want to bench Tyreek Hill. Okay, people are saying bench Tyreek.
All right, I love that.
People are speaking. It's certainly under strong consideration now.
I'm for what it's worth, and I already gave the argument. I totally feel the same way. I'm at a point now where I want to follow the hot hand. I have just not seen enough out of this Dolphins offense to feel like having Tua back is going to change the outlook for Tyreek in the way that we had anticipated, in part because of the way that they're spreading around to too many people.
Like I said, we'll play this off a little bit based off what happens tonight with Saquon versus A.J. Brown, but your voices have been heard. The people are speaking right now.
I want to know. I can't wait to hear.
Yeah, I sort of can because I can sort of wait because I'm afraid of the agony that could come if I choose wrong. But yeah, I will be carefully deciding.
Do we do
YouTube chat board? But yes, but no, because I might just listen to them and take them up on it.
Just do it.
Yeah, so we'll see.
We'll check back in tomorrow.
Oh, man.
When we're a little bit farther in to see if you've been able to time to process it.
A.J. Brown goes for 30 tonight and Saquon goes for 10.
You're going to start Tyreek Hill anyways just for the upside of it?
Maybe. We'll see.
Oh,
we'll see. Maybe.
Oh, Field.
Yeah, we'll see.
All right, that's going to do it for us today. Fantasy Focus presented by Boost Mobile. We're going to be back tomorrow, me, Field, and Stefania, breaking down everything
Mike's
that you need to
still
know, not only from Thursday Night Football, but for the rest of Week 11. Don't forget to love each other. Be kind to yourself. We'll see you guys on Friday.
Later. From